Glass trade beads represent some of the earliest intercontinental trade currencies and markets in the Americas. From Venice to China, beads introduced to the indigenous people of the Americas allowed artistic creativity to flourish. This week, we're going to look at beadwork as an art and its significance to learning about the native cultures in this edition of Artifact of the Week. With the introduction of the horse to North America in the mid-17th century, Plains Indians developed a new culture around the use of horses as beasts of burden, saving them time and effort traveling to and from destinations. By the late 1700s, that extra time had been utilized by Native women to make more detailed and elaborate porcupine quillwork. Quillwork is an art form unique solely to the indigenous North Americans, seen most commonly in the northern plains, northeast woodland, and subarctic regions, dating back hundreds of years before the first European interactions. Used usually to decorate moccasins and other clothing articles, quillwork is made by cutting porcupine quills to usable lengths, boiling and dyeing them to desired colors, then flattening each quill with bone tools or simply with one's teeth before attaching them to the buckskin garment via a needle and sinew. It's a painstakingly long and detailed process, but the result is a beautiful, almost seamless piece of wearable art. By the early 1800s, women saw opportunities to use glass beads to simulate these quillwork designs or garnish already quilled garments to give them more decoration. This would evolve over the next few decades into new demands for smaller glass beads, which could be stitched with sinew onto clothing and shoes without as much timely effort as it would take to quill the same piece, and achieve a relatively similar decorative result. The response by American glassmakers, now creating beads themselves solely for the trade market with indigenous people for bison hides, was the seed bead. Seed beads were the smallest glass trade beads traded on the continent and measure 2 millimeters or roughly 5/64ths of an inch or less, not to be mistaken with small pony beads which range slightly larger. These tiny new beads started to hit the trade markets on the plains around 1840. Some early seed beads can be identified from white or light green colored insides of each bead, referred to as white or green hearts. The inception of seed beads on the trade market added more options for Native people to choose from, and a new era of bead usage. These small beads could be used more minutely for greater detail in designs and imagery, and Native women very quickly began using them in a more elaborate manner, decorating clothing, moccasins, pouches, blanket strips, and more. By the 1860s, Cheyenne men could be seen adorned with thousands of seed beads running down their leggings, shirts, shoes, and even horse tack, almost like knights in shining, colorful glass armor. The women could be seen with carefully beaded patterns on their dresses and sheaths, carrying babies' cradles also ornamented with tiny glass jewels. This Comanche cradle is a great example of such beadwork. This brand new fashion style revolving around seed beads spread like wildfire across the plains cultures, and with it, an opportunity to capitalize on the obsession Americans suddenly had with the trend. Beaded moccasins, jackets, and gauntlets made of buckskin or bison hide were common items sold or traded back to American merchants on the frontier during the mid-19th century, creating a separate trade market solely for decorative beadwork. These beaded gauntlets from the 1840s represent some of these early seed beaded trade items, sold to Americans on the frontier. The latter half of the 19th century was especially hard on Native Americans. The once plentiful bison herds on the plains were now becoming very scarce, limiting trade opportunities and typical living patterns. In addition, conflicts between the ever-expanding United States and Plains Indian tribes resulted in stronger assimilation measures by the United States government. Natives were relocated to predetermined land reservations, and their children taken to mandatory boarding schools for a Euro-American education, further diluting their known native culture. As the lifestyle of the American Indian changed through this time period, so did the artistic nature of their beadwork. More personal designs were being implemented, like specific floral patterns, in addition to the traditional geometric patterns seen in the decades before. One of those patterns can be seen here. This style of beadwork took precedence over some older, simpler designs, and it is the style which we see the most contemporary beadwork today. These fully beaded designs are created one row at a time with an applique stitch, commonly called a lane stitch today, and a hump stitch by some Sioux craftspeople, to attach a row of 4 or 5 beads to the hide being decorated. Each row is like a piece to the larger puzzle that is the general design. With the uncertainty of the future of cultures and customs of the indigenous people, early anthropologists at the turn of the 20th century attempted to save as much evidence as possible in hopes that the knowledge of the first American cultures would be preserved for others to learn in future generations if it were to disappear from the everyday world. One of these early individuals was Ernest Thompson Seton, an author, artist, and naturalist. Seton became deeply interested in learning and teaching the ways of indigenous people. Seton's collection of Native American artifacts is currently on display here at the National Scouting Museum at Philmont Scout Ranch. This pair of buckskin leggings, owned and sometimes used by Seton for teaching purposes, is beaded in a fashion common to the late 19th century plains leggings, with a white background, triangular designs running down the length of the garment. Notice the bunching of each row of the lane stitch beadwork. This jacket, owned by Daniel Carter Beard, another founder of Scouting in the United States, shows a less traditional view of elk, flowers, and other personal designs. Note the difference between the style of imagery on this compared to the gauntlets seen earlier. Thankfully, the fears of indigenous culture completely disappearing through the 20th century were not true. Native craftsmen and women have been reviving their art forms in recent decades and can still be found online making amazing contemporary and traditional pieces. This beaded pouch is an example of beadwork in the modern era, made by various Navajo artists, and can still be found with other contemporary beadwork in our gift shop here at the National Scouting Museum. For half a millennia, glass beads have been traded and sold in the Americas as a currency, fashion statement, and art form. These brief histories should help you to better understand the significance behind their uses here for so very long, and better appreciate their uses still today. That's all we have time for today. Join us next time as we continue to learn more about the history of the BSA and Philmont Scout Ranch through the collections here at the National Scouting Museum and Artifact of the Week.